Now I know what you're thinking. Dear God, is Shirley Jackson back from the grave? No, it's me, Josh, from Josh's Bookish Voyage. Okay, in all seriousness, I'm here to review Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life by Ruth Franklin, a biography about the life of Shirley Jackson, and discuss it in conjunction with my thoughts on Shirley Jackson's personal memoirs as well. Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life was written by Ruth Franklin. Franklin is an American literary critic who spent 6 years researching Shirley Jackson's work and life to write this book. Once published, she was awarded several accolades for her efforts. Among these is the Bram Stoker Award for Best Nonfiction, the Edgar Award for Best Critical Biography, and the National Book Critic Award for Biography. And after reading this myself, I can unequivocally say that she absolutely earned these awards. Now, I by no means would consider myself a Shirley Jackson superfan going into this book. Granted, this outfit might say otherwise, but any chance of me not being a superfan has been completely undone by this fantastic biography. Now, I've read some of Jackson's biggest works, The Haunting of Hill House, Lottery, and the other short stories, as well as her 2 memoirs I've already hinted at. But there are several I've yet to read. Signature among those is probably Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Now, any hesitation I might have had about reading this work or any of her other works has completely vanished. Franklin has inspired me to read Jackson's entire list of works, and then reread this biography once I'm done to fully appreciate Jackson's work and its impact on the world. Now, I originally sought out this autobiography after reading Jackson's first memoir, Life Among Savages. I read it back in October of 2019, and at the time I had only read her Haunting of Hill House book. I was still inspired off of Netflix's new adaptation of the book and eager to learn more about Jackson and her life. I wanted to get a serious look into Jackson's psyche, to understand how someone could create something so dark yet so delightful. And because I know she is such an important figure for her work in the horror genre. Now imagine my disappointment when I found out this memoir was less of a memoir and more of an outtake of what it's like to be a housewife in the 1950s, or more specifically, what you were expected to be as a housewife. There's really nothing here discussing her personal life outside of her kids and her parenting them. Never is there a mention of her writing. The only saving grace of this memoir is that there was a hint of satirical commentary on society. But overall, the book comes across as somewhat antiquated. I couldn't decide if Jackson was being cleverly critical or doing exactly as it seems, trying to paint herself as the perfect housewife. I ended up deciding that it's probably somewhere in the middle of that. Franklin does a deep dive into these memoirs and what motivated Jackson to write these and what exactly she was trying to get from it. And for the most part, it seems I was probably right, that it is somewhere in the middle there, being a mix of critique and showcasing. My point here is that I was really left wanting after reading that memoir, and I realized that it was never meant to be a peek into her actual life. So I approached this memoir with that in mind, hoping to get a deeper look into her life and into her mind. And thankfully, that's exactly what I got. This biography excels because it's more than just a look at her life. It is a critique of how her life influenced her work and vice versa. This is as much a critical look at Jackson's literary works as it is at her personal life. And Franklin's expertise as a literary critic really shines through in that aspect. And as someone who has grown to really enjoy reading biographies by celebrities and other significant people in history, I must say this is one of the best biographies I've ever read. Sure, I'm biased as a fan of Shirley Jackson, but objectively speaking, there was a lot in here to love. It is at times almost academic in its detail, but never is it actually dull. The hardest part entering this book was adjusting to how dense it was of a work, but that quickly morphed into a compelling story of her life. Now, obviously the book is very long. It's over 600 pages, but somehow I was never bored. I found myself lying in bed at night, just staring at the ceiling while I listened to the audiobook, eager to find out what happens next. Needless to say, this book is a masterpiece, and I absolutely loved it. I'm really doing this hairdo right now, aren't I? Like, I love that I brushed it. It looks great. Yes, I'm giving you Shirley for days. Now back to the review. Now, that said, there are some caveats here. Because this is a literary analysis, Franklin walks us through every single significant work that Jackson wrote. That means she has to spoil and give us the big reveals and walk us through the arc of all of Jackson's works. That includes how the story would originate, but also how it slowly morphs into the story we know today. Of course, if you haven't read Jackson's work and you intend to, Obviously, you should do that before you read this biography. Luckily, I'm not the kind of person who tends to be bothered by spoilers. Plus, I'm often very forgetful. So hopefully it won't affect my enjoyment of these books when I finally get around to reading them. Now, while I highly recommend you read Jackson's other works before reading this, there is an exception to that. The exception to that will be the memoirs that I mentioned before. Like I said, the memoirs felt antiquated and at times almost a little disingenuous in the sense that she's trying to sell an idea of who she'd like to be, not who she actually is. Now, it's interesting to hear Franklin's discussion of what went into Jackson's mind as she was writing this and what was the motivation behind it. And given the somewhat dated nature of the memoirs, I think you're much more likely to get a lot out of those memoirs if you read them after hearing Franklin's diagnosis or analysis of them. Now, sure, you could read the memoirs, then the biography, and then reread the memoirs to a full effect. But quite frankly, I don't think the memoirs are worth reading twice. Honestly, if you are not a fan of Shirley Jackson and don't intend to read all of her works, I don't see any special reason to read the memoirs. Like, the only reason I read them was because I had a special interest in Shirley Jackson. As a work of nonfiction or fiction, as it's kind of a mesh of both, it doesn't really stand out. But obviously, ultimately, that's your decision to make how you read those or if you read them at all. As a person, Jackson can come across as not always the most likable, which was, I guess, not the biggest surprise. Obviously, there are parts of her life that are very pitiful. She really did have a rather haunted life. She suffered in a bad marriage to a husband who was unfaithful and not very attentive to her needs. She had a mother who was mentally abusive and just not very kind. On top of that, she just had to survive in a patriarchal society as a woman. And as a result, she ended up suffering from an addiction to alcohol and various medications. On top of that, she also had to deal with a serious weight problem. She was constantly trying to lose weight. And all of these complications led together to her dying fairly early, before she even turned 50. Now, there were a few other interesting details that I'd like to talk about from her life. One thing that really stood out to me was her friendship to Ralph Ellison. I never knew how close they were, or how Franklin seemed to suggest that their friendship may have fed into one another's works. And it makes me want to reread Invisible Man, not to be confused with H.G. Wells' The Invisible Man, to get a different perspective. Also, it's just been a long time since I've read it. Another thing worth noting is that there were a few times in Jackson's life where she expressed some somewhat homophobic views. Specifically, when we were talking about one of her novels where people would allude to it being themes in dealing with lesbianism, and she did not like that, and her response to that was, like I said, homophobic. Now, Franklin says she is a product of her time, but it's disappointing nevertheless, obviously. I also found it hard to sympathize from the get-go because she comes from a fairly wealthy family. At the same time, Jackson's story is rather humanizing to really show how even people who are well off can have a very difficult life. On top of that, to be fair, Jackson wasn't rich her whole life, even if her parents were fairly well off. In fact, there were plenty of times throughout her life where it's clear that she is stretched for cash. Overall, no one is perfect. That's especially true for Jackson. Nevertheless, I am still left mesmerized at Jackson as a person and as a writer. And as much as it has to do with Jackson's talent, that also has to do with Franklin's talent and how well she was able to convey that in this amazing biography. There are plenty of biographies that I have loved reading, but few have added to the conversation of that individual person as well as Franklin has about Shirley Jackson. What's more, rarely are they able to portray the figure as quite as significant as Franklin does with Jackson. Now, obviously, part of that is Jackson herself, but the other part is a byproduct of Franklin's effort at putting the story together in such a way that happens. Obviously, this book gets a solid 5 out of 5 for me. I highly recommend it, but like I said, you might want to check out the other books before you read this. But let me know if you have read this or if you plan on reading it. Let me know if you're a fan of Shirley Jackson, if you've read her other works, if you've read her memoirs especially, because that's obviously part of the conversation here. And also let me know if you love this wig right now, because I am loving it. And as always, I hope you have a fantastic day and a spooky Halloween. Good day.